Okay, good morning, everybody. We'll get going with this. Any questions before I jump into material? Look into my chat. Okay. So we want to jump over and start thinking about some more details with the immune response, the adaptive response. So we think about all sorts of different cells participating in immune responses. And the production of antibodies is a big factor when we think about some specific defenses. There are numerous cells that help to participate in these activities to give us really what we think about as some immunity, some ability to respond to things. And we'll talk about all sorts of different potentials with how we may be acquiring these types of immune responses. So initially, as we see this first image, I find it quite disturbing. Polio is something that we don't really think about too much. Something probably not really on our radar. Through massive vaccination efforts, it's something that really, at least in the US, is not something that is something super common anymore. All right. There are still some potentials, and I believe, unless he has passed away, there is still an individual that relies on an iron lung, but I think there's only one. I think most people that had contracted polio back in the day aren't with us anymore, but I think there's still one using an iron lung, which is really pretty crazy to think. So nasty viral infection that in turn could leave the individual paralyzed. And in these circumstances, these individuals all with polio and can't breathe on their own. So they have to live in these iron lungs, which I find really pretty disturbing. So this image is something that we're going to see again as we move through here and think about some details about immunity. It's kind of a generalization. We're looking at concentrations of antibody going up on the Y and a time frame, whatever it might be, going across the x-axis. We don't have any actual values with this, but we technically could be making some measurements and truly get an actual figure and see how this is occurring. We will go through and talk about these mechanisms for producing immune responses and different types of antibodies that we may be seeing, because there are classes of immunoglobulins or antibodies that can be produced dependent upon specific situations. All right. So this could be something like coming in contact with some substance and producing a response. It could be a situation where we think about a vaccination and the responses that are generated with it one way or another. All right. We start off with our initial exposure to the substance, whatever it might be, and the level of antibody is basically baseline right here. It's flat. We haven't produced immunoglobulins or antibodies against this foreign substance, but it stimulates our body to recognize and respond. And we'll go through and talk about these details as we progress through. We could see initially a small peak here, potentially a couple of weeks, maybe. Like I said, we're not really showing any time frame in here, but it might take a couple of weeks or so to get this initial response. So this primary immune response peaking, and then it starts to decline. At some later point, we get another exposure, this secondary exposure, at this time doesn't need as much time to respond because these immune cells are capable of producing what we call memory cells, some cells that basically stay back. They are already primed for the detection of whatever it is that we were initially exposed to. And upon second exposure, these guys respond almost instantaneously. And we can see the amount of antibody that's generated starts very quickly, and it spikes considerably higher levels of antibody compared to the primary response. This would be if we were thinking about a good immune response where you're actually capable of producing something like this. And in some circumstances, these responses are fantastic. And in other circumstances, they're maybe not as strong. When we think about some vaccination situations, there are some vaccines that we may think of as conferring lifelong immunity, and others that potentially require booster shots. Tetanus shot is a good example of something that requires a booster every 10 years or so. They recommend that you get a booster shot against tetanus. And if you don't remember your last shot, probably time for another one, right? So after that secondary response and it starts to decline, you can see that the level of antibody at this point stays elevated and potentially elevated like this for a considerable amount of time, giving the individual more of a protective type of immunity because of this stimulus. There could be a similar idea with this if we think about maybe like a allergic reaction, and we will mention this a little later on, but when it comes to allergies, you get exposed to the first